On a grey November morning in 1995, a solitary figure collapsed in his home in the quiet countryside of East Sussex, England. This was a man who had once commanded empires from the shadows, a titan whose very name made promoters tremble. Yet his final moments were witnessed by no one, a stark and silent end for one of rock music's most formidable architects. His death forces a haunting question about the fate of those who stand behind the legends, the invisible hands that build the thrones. In 1968, a seismic shift occurred in the landscape of rock and roll. It was the year Jimmy Page, a sought-after session guitarist, assembled the quartet that would become Led Zeppelin, inviting the thunderous vocals of Robert Plant and the earth-shattering drumming of John Bonham, with John Paul Jones anchoring the low end on bass. Yet, every legend needs a cornerstone, and for Led Zeppelin, that was a mountain of a man named Peter Grant, a former professional wrestler and film stuntman who had found his true calling in the music business. How did a man built for the ring become the most formidable power broker in the industry, and what dark price would he pay for the empire he built? Grant's imposing physicality was his greatest weapon, a tangible threat in a world of handshake deals. This was no mere figurehead. He was the architect of a new kind of power, one that demanded absolute control with an iron fist. He and Page, the quiet visionary, formed an unlikely alliance, a marriage of brute force and artistic brilliance that would forge a legend. Theirs was a dominion built not on a single hit, but on a decade of unprecedented dominance, a period so successful it seemed to exist outside the natural order of things. They were not just a band, they were a self-contained universe, one where every aspect of their world was meticulously managed and fiercely protected. Grant's philosophy was simple. The music came first, and nothing would be allowed to compromise it, not record labels, not promoters, and certainly not the press. He built a wall around his charges so high that they became more than musicians, they became mythical figures. But as with all myths built on such intense control, a shadow began to form, one that would eventually eclipse the very light it was meant to protect. The contract Grant wrested from Atlantic Records in 1969 reads like a victory carved in stone. It was a deal with no cap on the number of albums the band could deliver, a near unheard of concession that handed Led Zeppelin the keys to the kingdom. While other acts were bound by options and quotas, Grant's prize gave his charges total creative freedom. This was not luck. It was the foresight of a man who understood that scarcity breeds value. He then built a model that would make the band the most coveted act on the planet, a simple yet radical notion. No singles, only albums. Grant reasoned that forcing fans to buy the record in its entirety at a premium price would amplify both revenue and anticipation. The strategy was a masterstroke, turning each release into a cultural event rather than a fleeting chart entry. It created a monstrous demand, a hunger that a single 45 could never satisfy. Why give away a meal when you can sell a feast? The approach ran counter to the very fabric of the British music industry. Through 1969, the band rarely issued singles at home, leaving a vacuum that only an album purchase could fill. Their contemporaries were churning out 45s for the jukeboxes, but Grant was building monuments. This calculated restraint made the albums not just music, but sacred objects that fans had to own in full. The crowds flocked, the cash registers roared, and the band's mystique grew with every record they refused to cut. Was there ever a more elegant business trap laid to capture a global audience? This was the engine that would soon make them, and the men behind them, impossibly wealthy. The scale of what Peter Grant had built was almost impossible to grasp from the outside. The Guinness Book of World Records recognized Led Zeppelin as the second best-selling band in American history, with more than 111.5 million certified units sold. Every album, every t-shirt, every ticket funneled a river of cash through a network of companies that Grant controlled with an iron grip. By 2023, Billboard ranked them as the third highest-grossing act of all time, trailing only the Beatles and Taylor Swift, with over $780 million in revenue. That kind of money bent the laws of physics around the people who touched it. The sums were so vast that they ceased to feel like currency and morphed into pure abstract power. Grant stood at the center of this financial universe, a colossus who collected percentages from every single stream. He managed the publishing, the touring, the merchandising, and the bank accounts, all flowing in a direction he alone dictated. The figures paint a picture of a band that had become a self-sustaining economic empire, a corporation disguised as 4 musicians and 1 impossible manager. They did not release singles, so the only way to own their music was to buy the entire album, a strategy that padded their coffers with every purchase. The magnificent irony is that the magnitude of this triumph only sharpens the tragedy that was waiting in the wings. The higher the tower, the harder the fall, and every dollar that crossed Grant's desk added weight to the collapse that would eventually bury him. The very structures designed to protect the band's wealth became the machinery of its managers unravelling. The occult shadow hanging over Led Zeppelin was cast first by Jimmy Page, a man whose obsession with the esoteric ran far deeper than stage theatrics. In 1971, he purchased Boleskine House on the shores of Loch Ness, a property once owned by Aleister Crowley, the self-styled Great Beast, whose philosophy of forbidden knowledge the guitarist openly admired. This wasn't a casual acquisition for Page. He saw himself as a serious student of the occult, amassing a vast collection of Crowley manuscripts, robes and paintings. The very walls of his new home seemed to whisper of dark rituals and unholy pacts, sowing the image of a man in dialogue with forces beyond the rational. Such a fixation inevitably summoned whispers of a bargain struck in the basement of the damned, a deal with the devil himself. A pervasive belief took root among fans that Led Zeppelin had signed away their mortal souls in exchange for meteoric fame and stratospheric success. This legend, painted in the dark hues of a Faustian pact, was never confirmed by any band member, yet it clung to them like a second skin. It grew so loud that it became a crucial part of the band's mythology, a story told in hushed tones in record shops and dorm rooms across the globe. But for Robert Plant, the curse was no myth. It had a name and a face, and it struck with the devastating suddenness of a hurricane. In the summer of 1977, while the band was riding high on a wave of unprecedented commercial power, Plant received word that his 5-year-old son, Karak, had died suddenly from a stomach infection. The news shattered his world, and the golden promise of rock stardom turned to ash in his mouth. He was immediately consumed by a profound darkness, a heavy feeling that led him to believe a malevolent force had targeted the band. So deep was his conviction that he temporarily withdrew from the spotlight, questioning not just the future of the group, but the very cost of their shared ambition. Could his son have been the price for an unholy ascendancy? The deeper you dig, the more the lines between deliberate myth-making and genuine dread begin to blur. Was this imposing narrative of supernatural retribution simply a brilliant piece of marketing, carefully crafted by a savvy manager to sell records? Or was it a real tangible cloud of misfortune that followed the band's every move, shaping their destiny in ways they could never control? Maybe the most disturbing truth is that the question itself matters more than the answer. For a band who reached such dizzying heights of power, the notion that they might have stood on a foundation of their own damnation feels strangely inevitable, a narrative tragedy so perfectly formed it almost had to be true. Either way, the darkness was not merely a stylistic choice. It had become an active participant in their story, an unseen hand ready to guide them toward the next calamity. The scale of the indulgence was hard to fathom even by rock and roll standards. Richard Cole, the tour manager who moved through the world with the title The Gaffer, later sat down to write his memoir, and in the pages of Stairway to Heaven, he laid it all bare, describing how he and the band blew through millions of dollars on the road. It wasn't just the private jets or the luxury suites, but the casual purchasing of everything in sight and the wanton destruction of hotel rooms that turned each tour into a rolling, high-speed bonfire of cash. Cole's accounts, published in 1992 and picked up by Billboard, painted a picture of a crew so insulated by their own success that money had lost all relation to effort or value. Peter Grant, meanwhile, had perfected the art of moving through the world, as if the world owed him a living, and in 1975 he was among the very first to secure a private nightclub and personal aircraft for his charges, as noted by the Times. This wasn't just transportation. It was a declaration that Led Zeppelin did not exist in the same realm as other bands, that they had transcended the very idea of a touring act to become something closer to a travelling royal court. The image was one of absolute untouchable power, and for a few years it worked flawlessly. But you have to wonder what happens to a man's judgment when he begins to believe his own myth, when every whim is catered to before it's even voiced, and when there is no one left to tell him no. The band's aura of invincibility became a self-fulfilling prophecy, shielding them from the mundane consequences that would have felled any other act. Yet beneath the glittering surface of this opulent empire, hairline cracks were beginning to spider across the foundation of their management. The very excess that cemented their legendary status was the same force that started to erode the discipline and sharp-eyed vigilance that had built it in the first place. A slow unravelling of the threads that held the whole grand design together, and it was precisely this unchecked, unaccountable power that would soon lead them into one of the darkest and most appalling episodes of their entire career. The story that refused to die with the band began on a summer night in 1969, inside a room at the Edgewater Inn in Seattle. The hotel had a bizarre gimmick that defined its character, allowing guests to fish directly from the windows of their rooms, a quirk that would soon frame one of rock's most infamous scandals. It was there that Richard Cole, the band's formidable tour manager, and a member of the crew were accused of committing a profoundly disturbing act with an underage female fan. The incident, which became known as the Shark episode, remains a dark, horrific stain on the band's legacy, a story that is almost too grotesque to believe, yet it is thoroughly documented. The accusation was that Cole and another man used a dead shark to assault the girl, a depraved act that has since become a chilling part of rock history. This event is cited as one of the first and most serious scandals to hit Led Zeppelin, a shocking revelation that came at the height of their early success. The sheer depravity of the allegation, as reported by The Independent, painted a picture of a hedonistic and dangerous inner circle that surrounded the band. For Cole, it was just another night of excess, but for the public, it was a glimpse into a world of absolute power and moral decay. The setting itself was as wild as the story, as the Edgewater was built over the water in Seattle, with large windows designed so anglers could cast their lines straight out into Elliott Bay. This unique feature created a space where the boundary between the natural world and human hedonism blurred in the most disturbing way imaginable. While the hotel has since been renovated and still operates today, its management refuses to discuss the happenings of 1969. The silence, as noted by the Seattle Times, does little to diminish the weight of the story, allowing the ghosts of that night to linger in the memory of rock and roll. Cole's role was crucial to this narrative. He was less a manager and more of a ringmaster in a circus of excess. This event was not a spontaneous lapse in judgment, but a manifestation of a culture he had cultivated, one where the band was above all law and consequence. He did not merely oversee the band's logistics. He orchestrated a chaotic environment where such an atrocity could unfold without immediate, profound consequences. The legal fallout was remarkably lax, which only empowered a sense of untouchability that would eventually prove catastrophic for everyone involved. The myth of Peter Grant rests on the sheer force of his presence, a man who ran the world's biggest band less like a business and more like a criminal syndicate. The Ringer, writing in 2019, captured how he used intimidation and violence, not as an occasional outburst, but as a deliberate system of control. He was legendary for crushing the con artists who circle every successful act, but his methods made the record labels and venue owners view him with a kind of terrified awe. This wasn't about anger, it was a calculated performance designed to make people comply. Louder Sound noted in 2021 that his mafia-style management was a conscious tactic, with him always flanked by bodyguards and often carrying a weapon. This wasn't paranoia, it was a means of pressure, ensuring promoters met his demands without question. He wielded this power like a physical extension of the band's own music, heavy and immovable. But how long can a house built on fear and force stand before the foundations begin to crack? That question found its answer in July 1977, with the infamous beating at the Oakland Coliseum that History.com would later document. The band's security, under Grant's direction, brutally attacked a backstage worker they believed had insulted the family of a crew member. It was a moment of explosion, the violent fruit of years of unchecked aggression, and it shocked the world. In June of that same year, the arrests of Grant, Jimmy Page and Richard Cole after the ensuing riot seemed almost inevitable, yet no one served time, a testament to the power of their lawyers and the lack of evidence that Rolling Stone reported on at the time. The Oakland incident wasn't just a scandal, it was a public fracture, the first real sign of the crumbling edifice. The public's perception shifted, and the band's invincibility was suddenly in question. The dark magic of their management style finally turned inward. For Grant, the line between protecting his charges and losing himself had vanished, and the cost of the throne was becoming terrifyingly clear. Peter Grant had spent the better part of 2 decades constructing an empire so vast and so meticulously controlled that its architecture seemed immune to collapse. Yet beneath the surface of that formidable structure, The foundations were quietly rotting away, and the rot had a name: money. By the late 70s, the same man who had once outmaneuvered every promoter and label executive in the business found himself entangled in a legal battle that cut to the very heart of his own creation, suing the management company that bore his name over royalties that had mysteriously vanished into the cracks of his own labyrinthine system. It was a strange and almost poetic irony, the architect of the most lucrative deal in rock history discovering that his own fortress had been built with doors left ajar for unseen hands to slip through. The labyrinth he had designed was, by any measure, a masterpiece of financial engineering. At the peak of his power, Grant operated a sprawling network of management and publishing firms, a corporate web so intricate that it governed nearly every financial current flowing toward Led Zeppelin, from the publishing rights to the box office receipts of every monumental tour. Nothing moved without his knowledge, or so he believed. But the very complexity that made the machine so efficient also made it impossible to watch every corner, and the opacity that had once been his greatest weapon in negotiation became the perfect cover for the leakage that would eventually bleed him dry. The question was not whether the system could be exploited, but who had been doing the exploiting all along. What followed was a slow, grinding unravelling that stripped away the layers of invincibility he had so carefully cultivated. The legal battles over missing royalties were just the beginning. They exposed a financial reality that was far more fragile than the public image of unassailable success. Grant, the man who had once commanded millions with the wave of a hand, found himself sinking into a personal abyss where the lines between his professional triumph and his private devastation blurred beyond recognition. By the final years of his life, the cocaine addiction that had once seemed like a tool for maintaining the relentless pace of his work had consumed him entirely, and the fortune he had amassed had dwindled to nearly nothing, leaving him to face the stark reality of his own ruin. When Led Zeppelin finally came to an end, the man who had stood at the centre of their universe retreated from the world with a finality that mirrored the silence of the band itself. He became a recluse on his Sussex farm, a ghost haunting the remnants of a life that had once burned so brightly, his rare appearances only serving to remind those who saw him of how far he had fallen. The formidable figure who had once terrorised promoters and protected his charges with the fury of a bear was now a solitary man, watching the last vestiges of his legacy fade from his grasp. How does a man who commanded the highest peaks of the music industry end up alone, broke and forgotten, a prisoner in the very kingdom he had built? The morning of September 25, 1980, dawned grey over Windsor, and the world of rock music was about to fracture in a way no one could have braced for. John Bonham, the thunderous heart of Led Zeppelin, was found dead in his bed at Jimmy Page's house, a man who had consumed roughly 40 shots of vodka the night before. It was a grotesque, almost cartoonish end for a drummer whose power seemed to rival the very forces of nature. The official cause was as stark as it was tragic: asphyxiation from his own vomit, a brutal final consequence of his legendary excess. In that single moment, the band's staggering machinery ground to a halt. For how does one summon the will to play Whole Lotta Love when the engine is gone? The remaining members, Page, Plant and Jones, faced a decision that would echo through eternity, one that they answered with a finality that stunned the industry. They announced that they could not continue without him, a statement that felt less like a choice and more like the recognition of an unalterable truth. There was to be no replacement, no new drummer, no phoenix rising from the ashes of the wreckage, just a profound and deafening silence where the beat used to be. Yet, in a peculiar twist that few have ever noted, no official declaration of disbandment was ever issued by the group. There was no legal filing, no press conference that formally dissolved the entity known as Led Zeppelin. They simply ceased to exist, fading out like the final chord of a song that would never be played again. Before the tragedy, there was a lightness to Bonham that often got lost in the bombast of his playing, a detail that makes the loss feel even more human. His nickname Bonzo was not derived from some ferocious beast, but rather from a mischievous mutant dog in the beloved British comic strip, The Bash Street Kids. It was a playful, almost gentle moniker for a man who could make the drums sound like a roaring avalanche, a stark contrast to the power he wielded. This little piece of trivia paints him not as an untouchable god of rock, but as a lad who found joy in a simple cartoon, which makes the grim circumstances of his exit all the more heartbreaking. How does a force of nature, a man so full of life, end up as a cautionary tale in a coroner's report? Richard Cole was known to everyone inside the Led Zeppelin machine as the gaffer, the iron-fisted road manager who orchestrated the chaos of the band's most infamous tours with ruthless efficiency. While Peter Grant commanded the empire from above, Cole was the man on the ground, the one who made sure the planes were ready, the hotel suites were stocked, and the unwanted questions never got answered. But when the band dissolved in 1980, the man who had once controlled every backstage door found himself with nothing left to manage. Cole tried to carry on, taking on management work for acts like The Who and Frank Zappa, yet the rhythm of that older, wilder era no longer fit a changing industry. The crash came quickly, and he sank into a long spiral of addiction that saw him ejected from multiple countries and unable to hold down any steady work. For years he drifted through a haze of substances, a ghost of the powerful figure who had once moved millions of dollars through the shadows of rock and roll. His recovery in the late 1980s did not bring him back to the music business, and the reason he gave was a deep wound that never healed. In 1992, Cole published his memoir, Stairway to Heaven, and the book detonated like a bomb in the band's delicate ecosystem. The members were furious, Robert Plant above all, because the pages exposed the sexual encounters and the drug use that the band had fought for 2 decades to keep out of print. Plant's bitterness found a voice in a 2005 interview with Q magazine, where he described showbiz as a con and admitted he trusted no one after watching Peter and Richard self-destruct. There is something profoundly sad about that sentence, because it reveals how the curse did not just destroy the managers, it also poisoned the trust between the artists and the very people who bled for them. Cole never truly returned to the industry, scarred too deeply by the very world he had helped to build. And yet, he was not an outlier, because the statistics suggest that the entire industry has been running on the same broken fuel for decades. A 2018 study from the University of Westminster found that 71% of music industry workers, including managers, had experienced symptoms of anxiety or depression. That figure is a quiet indictment of an entire system, one that celebrates the artist on stage while quietly consuming the people standing behind the curtain. Cole survived his own demons, but his story reads less like a redemption arc and more like a long, slow retreat from a battle that had already been lost. The man who once commanded armies of roadies and bodyguards ended his career as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the machinery of fame is hungry and it does not discriminate. There is a strange silence that follows a legend's collapse, a quiet that feels louder than the roar of a sold-out arena ever did. The research that exists now offers a clinical vocabulary for the devastation Peter Grant embodied, as if naming the ailment might somehow tame its history. A study in the Journal of Music, Health and Wellbeing from 2020 frames the manager's downfall as a textbook case of burnout, triggered by prolonged pressure, social isolation, and the total absence of psychological support. Even more revealing is a 2016 project from the University of Sydney, which found that managers in the creative industries are so thoroughly invisibilized by the public that they rarely receive the intervention they desperately need when a crisis hits. The people who hold the flashlights for the stars are, by design, left standing in the dark themselves. Organizational psychologists have even coined a term for the phenomenon that consumed Grant, calling it managerial sacrifice, a genuine and documented pattern where the custodian of a talent destroys their own health to shield the artist from harm. It is a slow and calculated erosion, a professional suicide committed in installments, and it feeds directly into a self-destructive spiral that the industry has yet to fully dismantle. And yet, the infrastructure that might catch these falling figures remains shockingly flimsy, since a 2019 survey by the Music Industry Research Association found that only 34% of music managers in the UK operate with a clearly defined employment contract. Without that legal bedrock, there is no safety net, only the hard, unforgiving ground of the business. So how does one build a fortress against a curse that seems to target the very people who build the empires? The first line of defense is a financial plan engineered for survival, not just for boom years. You begin by establishing a separate emergency fund that is completely walled off from touring revenue and artist royalties, ensuring you are never left with nothing when a collaboration ends. Next, you appoint a designated contrarian, a lawyer or CPA who is emphatically not a fan of the artist and can openly veto a lavish spending decision without fear of losing their access. Every 6 months, you must recalculate your debt-to-income ratio, keeping a hard warning line at 30% to prevent the high-interest spiral that drags so many in show business under. And finally, you build your own exit strategy, quietly investing in industries that have nothing to do with music, so that your life does not disintegrate the moment the management agreement expires.